Something just happened in Westminster that nobody thought was possible. In the middle of a live parliamentary session, King Charles stepped in, broke centuries of royal silence and left the Prime Minister completely frozen. MPs sat in shock. Ministers walked out, markets panicked, and within minutes, the very survival of this government was thrown into doubt. What unfolded wasn't just drama. It was the beginning of a full-scale political collapse, and Britain may never be the same again. At exactly the moment Parliament believed it was business as usual, everything changed. Keir Starmer was on his feet, delivering what aides had described as a routine defence of his latest legislative push. The chamber was restless but calm, MPs murmuring, papers shuffling, the familiar rhythm of Westminster playing out as it has for generations. Then the doors opened. The Sergeant-at-Arms entered, carrying the ceremonial black rod, and a wave of confusion rippled through the room. This was not scheduled. This was not normal. The monarch does not interrupt live proceedings, ever. Starmer stopped mid-sentence. His voice failed him. Witnesses say the colour drained from his face as the meaning of the moment landed all at once. Within seconds, MPs were on their feet, whispering in disbelief as the House of Commons was summoned immediately to the House of Lords. What awaited them there was unlike anything modern Britain has seen. King Charles stood at the throne, but stripped of the usual symbolism. No crown, no robes, just a dark suit and a face etched with strain and resolve. This was not ceremony. This was confrontation. When protocol officers attempted to begin formal proceedings, the king raised his hand and stopped them cold. His words were quiet, controlled, and devastating. He said he had watched this government edge the country toward danger while tradition demanded his silence, but that silence, he warned, could no longer continue. By attempting to override long-standing parliamentary conventions, the Prime Minister had crossed a constitutional line that could not be ignored. The chamber erupted. Shouts echoed from the benches. MPs talked over one another. The Speaker's calls for order were swallowed by chaos. And through it all, Starmer stood motionless. He didn't argue. He didn't respond. He couldn't. The king had just publicly questioned his judgment, his leadership, and his respect for the constitutional framework that holds Britain together. Cameras caught the next moment clearly. One cabinet minister stood up and walked out, then another, then another. 3 senior figures gone in less than 2 minutes. The message was unmistakable. Authority was evaporating in real time. But the most explosive moment was still to come. After the walkouts, the king continued, his voice stronger now, more forceful. He revealed that in recent weeks he had received thousands of letters from ordinary British citizens, not activists, not party loyalists, grandparents, workers, teachers, veterans, people who felt abandoned, unheard, and afraid that the country they loved was being dismantled without their consent. He spoke of fear spreading beyond politics, reaching into everyday homes, into families who no longer recognised the direction of their own nation. Then he reached into his pocket and held up a single letter. It was from a 94-year-old war veteran who had fought for Britain in its darkest hour, only to be told he must leave his home to make way for new government priorities. The king's voice faltered as he read the man's question. "Is this what I fought for?" There was no sound in the chamber. MPs stared at the floor. Some wiped their eyes. The silence was crushing. Outside Westminster, the reaction was instant and brutal. Markets trembled, the pound slipped, investors fled. Social media exploded as clips spread across the world. Within hours, polls showed public support for the government collapsing at an almost unbelievable speed. Inside Downing Street, panic set in. Emergency meetings were called, but half the cabinet didn't show. Allies turned distant. Rivals sensed blood. What had begun as a parliamentary session had turned into a national reckoning. This wasn't just a speech, it was a line being drawn, a warning that Britain's political system was under strain and that the consequences of ignoring tradition, restraint and public trust had finally arrived. The Prime Minister wasn't just challenged, he was exposed. And as Westminster descended into disorder, one truth became impossible to deny. This government didn't lose control gradually. It lost it in a single moment under the weight of a king who decided silence was no longer an option. As the shockwaves from the king's intervention spread beyond the walls of Parliament, the full scale of the damage began to reveal itself. Within minutes, political analysts across Britain were using words rarely heard in connection with a modern UK government. Collapse, paralysis, implosion. This was no longer just about a speech or a breach of protocol. This was about authority draining away in real time. Cameras followed MPs spilling out into corridors, phones pressed to ears, faces tight with panic. Senior Labour figures who had defended Starmer for months suddenly fell silent. Others quietly admitted what many were thinking, but few dared to say aloud. The Prime Minister's grip on power had snapped. Inside Downing Street, chaos took over. Emergency advisors scrambled to assess the fallout, but there was no playbook for a moment like this. The king had not merely criticised policy, he had questioned the moral legitimacy of the government itself. That distinction mattered. Sources close to number 10 say Starmer spent the first hour after the intervention pacing his office, replaying events again and again, convinced the palace had overstepped. But anger quickly gave way to fear as reports began to land. Cabinet ministers were refusing calls. Backbench MPs were openly discussing leadership alternatives. WhatsApp groups, once loyal to the Prime Minister, were suddenly filled with brutal honesty. The language was unforgiving. Words like finished, toxic, and unsalvageable dominated private conversations. Meanwhile, outside the political bubble, the public reaction was even more devastating. Within hours, videos of the king's words racked up millions of views. Comments flooded in from people who had never posted about politics before. Many weren't praising the monarchy. They were expressing relief that anyone, had finally voiced it, what they felt. Veterans shared their own stories of neglect. Pensioners spoke of fear and insecurity. Lifelong Labour voters admitted they no longer recognised the party they once trusted. This wasn't outrage manufactured by activists. It was raw, emotional disillusionment spilling into the open. Financial markets responded with ruthless speed. Traders don't wait for clarity, they react to risk, and risk was suddenly everywhere. The pound fell sharply as investors priced in instability. Major banks issued warnings to clients urging caution on UK assets. Billions were wiped from market value in a single afternoon. For ordinary families, this wasn't abstract. A weaker pound meant higher prices, rising mortgage pressure, and more uncertainty. The cost of political recklessness was landing directly on kitchen tables across the country. Back in Westminster, the opposition wasted no time. A vote of no confidence was tabled almost immediately, and for the first time it didn't feel symbolic. It felt inevitable. Even some Labour MPs privately admitted they couldn't defend the Prime Minister in the days ahead. Too much had been exposed. The King's intervention had stripped away the usual talking points and excuses. It reframed the crisis not as left versus right, but as responsibility versus recklessness. And in that framing, the government had nowhere to hide. What made the situation even more explosive were revelations beginning to surface behind the scenes. Senior figures confirmed that the palace had warned Downing Street weeks earlier about the constitutional risks of the government's approach. Letters had been sent, meetings held, concerns raised quietly, respectfully and repeatedly. All of them were ignored. Starmer's team believed the king would never act publicly. They gambled on silence, they were wrong, and that miscalculation turned a policy dispute into a historic confrontation. By nightfall, Britain was no longer just watching a political scandal, it was watching the slow-motion unravelling of a government that had lost its authority, its unity and its public trust in a single afternoon. The Prime Minister remained in office, but power had already begun slipping through his fingers. The question gripping the nation was no longer whether this government could survive the week, it was whether it deserved to survive at all. By the following morning, it became clear that the damage from the King's intervention was not fading with the news cycle, it was accelerating. What initially appeared as a single extraordinary moment had opened the floodgates to truths that had been buried for months. Leaked documents began circulating among journalists, confirming what insiders had quietly suspected. The Prime Minister and his closest advisers were fully aware that the palace opposed the legislation at the centre of the crisis. Multiple warnings had been delivered through official and private channels. Constitutional concerns were spelled out in plain language. Yet the government pushed ahead regardless, convinced that tradition would protect them from consequence. This revelation changed everything. It reframed the crisis from a misjudgment into a deliberate act of defiance. Starmer had not stumbled into this confrontation. He had walked into it with his eyes open, believing the monarchy would blink first. That assumption collapsed the moment the king stepped forward. To many MPs, this was unforgivable. It suggested a prime minister willing to gamble the stability of the country for political speed and personal control. In Westminster corridors, the word arrogance was used repeatedly, not by opponents, but by Labour figures who had once defended him. As pressure mounted, internal fractures within the Labour Party widened into open cracks. Emergency meetings took place behind closed doors, not to support the Prime Minister, but to discuss life after him. Senior MPs quietly sounded out potential successors. Others went further, questioning whether the party itself could survive this moment intact. Polling data leaked later that day showed support collapsing in traditional Labour strongholds at a pace no strategist could explain away. Voters who had remained loyal through previous scandals were walking away, not angrily but decisively. They felt deceived. The public mood hardened as more stories emerged. Veterans groups released statements describing years of neglect. Charities highlighted rising homelessness among former service members. These weren't new problems, but in the shadow of the King's words, they took on devastating clarity. The contrast between political promises and lived reality was suddenly impossible to ignore. For many viewers, this wasn't about monarchy versus government. It was about dignity, about who was being heard and who was being forgotten. International reaction added another layer of pressure. Allies expressed concern using the careful language of diplomacy, but the meaning was unmistakable. Britain, long seen as a model of political stability, now appeared volatile. Investors continued to pull back. Analysts warned that prolonged uncertainty could trigger lasting economic damage. Every hour the Prime Minister remained in office without a clear plan only deepened the sense of drift. Leadership requires authority, and authority had been shattered. Inside Number 10, the atmosphere was described as suffocating. Aides spoke of paranoia and isolation. The Prime Minister reportedly refused several calls from senior figures, convinced plots were forming around him. In many ways, he was right. Messages leaked from internal party groups revealed active discussions about removing him, not in weeks or months, but in days. Loyalty was evaporating. Survival instincts had taken over. What made this moment so dangerous was the absence of an exit strategy. Resigning could trigger a leadership contest the party might not survive. Staying on risked dragging the entire government down with him. Every option carried consequences, and each passing hour narrowed the path forward. The King's intervention had not just sparked a crisis, it had exposed how fragile the foundations of power had become. Britain now stood at a crossroads. One path led toward renewal, accountability, and a painful reckoning with recent decisions. The other led deeper into chaos, denial, and institutional breakdown. The Prime Minister's fate was no longer in his own hands. Events had overtaken him, and as the country watched, one question dominated every conversation. Had this single moment already sealed the end of his government, or was there something even bigger still to come? As the crisis deepened, a far more dangerous reality began to take shape beneath the surface. This was no longer simply a leadership problem or a temporary collapse in confidence. The very structure holding the government together was starting to fracture. Senior civil servants quietly began preparing contingency plans. Not for policy failure, but for institutional paralysis. Departments slowed decision-making. Major announcements were delayed. The machinery of government, normally rigid and relentless, began to hesitate. That hesitation sent a chilling signal to allies and adversaries alike. Britain was wobbling. More leaked information emerged, painting an even darker picture of the Prime Minister's judgment. Internal polling commissioned weeks earlier had already shown overwhelming public support for the king in any direct confrontation. The numbers were brutal. A clear majority of voters said they would side with the monarch over the government, regardless of party loyalty. Those figures were reportedly shared with the Prime Minister personally. He saw them. He understood them, and yet he chose to proceed. That decision now appeared not just reckless, but self-destructive. To many within his own party, it bordered on unforgivable. The reaction inside Labour headquarters was described as funereal. Staff members who had celebrated victory not long ago now spoke openly about preparing for defeat. Donors froze contributions. Local party organisers reported volunteers stepping away, unwilling to defend a leadership they no longer trusted. In traditional Labour heartlands, MPs faced furious constituents demanding explanations they could not give. The phrase heard again and again was betrayal, not from the king, from the government itself. Meanwhile, the opposition sharpened its attack with surgical precision. This was not loud outrage. It was controlled condemnation. Senior figures framed the crisis as a failure of character, not ideology. They argued that when a Prime Minister ignores warnings, disregards constitutional boundaries and dismisses public concern, the result is inevitable collapse. The narrative stuck because it matched what people had just witnessed with their own eyes. The king had not shouted, he had not threatened, he had simply refused to remain silent, and the government had folded under the weight of that exposure. Public discourse shifted dramatically. The usual political lines blurred. Monarchists and Republicans found themselves briefly aligned, not in loyalty to the crown, but in disgust at political arrogance. Younger voters, many of whom had little attachment to royal tradition, shared clips of the intervention with captions expressing disbelief and anger. For them, the moment symbolised something larger, a system that had stopped listening until it was forced to. Inside Westminster, the Prime Minister's isolation became impossible to hide. Cabinet meetings were sparsely attended. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms. Advisors who once shaped strategy now focused on damage control, quietly updating their CVs. Power once lost does not announce its departure. It simply disappears. And Starmer could feel it slipping away hour by hour. Perhaps the most telling sign came when senior party figures stopped asking how to save the government and started asking how to survive its fall. Plans were drawn up for interim leadership, names were floated, alliances shifted, the language of unity was replaced by the language of necessity. This was no longer about loyalty, it was about containment. Britain found itself suspended in uncertainty, markets remained unstable, international confidence continued to erode, ordinary families watched the headlines with a growing sense of unease. Us, aware that political instability always carries a price paid by the public. The Prime Minister remained in office, but authority had drained from the position. What remained was a title without control, a government without cohesion, and a country waiting for the next blow to land.